This is Mr. Wesley, and women are opting out. Not dramatically, not with manifestos or movements or public declarations. Quietly, in the specific and daily decisions of millions of women who are choosing, with increasing frequency and increasing deliberateness, to organize their lives around the absence of men rather than around partnership with them, choosing solitude over compromise, choosing their own company over the specific and ongoing cost of maintaining a relationship with a man who does not meet them at the level they have decided they require. The data on this is not ambiguous. Marriage rates among women under 40% have been declining for over a decade. The percentage of women who report that having a relationship with a man is important to their life satisfaction has dropped in every demographic survey conducted in the last 5 years. Women are initiating divorce at rates that have been documented consistently at approximately 65 to 70% of all divorces filed. Women are living alone at historically high rates and reporting higher life satisfaction scores in that solitude than equivalent surveys of men living alone produce. Women in the 18 to 35 demographic are, in increasing numbers, explicitly stating in surveys and in the public cultural conversation that they do not see a future that includes a male partner as a necessary or even desirable component of a good life. This is the heterofatalism trend that researchers have been documenting for several years, and that the cultural conversation has been either celebrating uncritically or dismissing defensively without doing what actually needs to be done with it, which is examining it honestly from the inside of the male experience of being on the receiving end of it, with the specific and clinical precision that tells you what it actually means for the men in this room. Because here is what the trend actually means for you, not for men in the abstract. For a man over 50 who has been through the ending of a long marriage and who is navigating the post-divorce years inside a cultural landscape that is sending him a specific and consistent signal about his value and his relevance in the relational world. The signal is this: women are deciding, in growing numbers and with growing conviction, that men are optional. That partnership with a man is a net cost rather than a net benefit. That the emotional labor, the relational compromise, the specific and ongoing work of maintaining a relationship with a man who does not meet them emotionally is a price they are no longer willing to pay. That signal, landing on a man who is already navigating the identity disruption of a long marriage's ending, does something specific to his sense of his own worth, something that most men in this situation are experiencing privately and processing inadequately because nobody is addressing it honestly. That is what today is about. Stay with me, because what I am going to give you is not a rebuttal of the trend or a defense of men as a category or a list of reasons why the women who are making this choice are wrong. What I am going to give you is an honest examination of what the trend is actually responding to, what it means at the level of individual male worth and male development, rather than at the level of cultural grievance, and the specific and practically useful framework for understanding what a man over 50 can actually do with this information, rather than simply being diminished by it. There is one specific thing in particular that the trend reveals about the gap between what men have been offering in long-term relationships and what women have been requiring from them. A gap that is more specific and more addressable than either side of the current cultural conversation is acknowledging, that I want to make sure lands clearly before this video ends. I am Mr. Wesley. This is Relational Insights, and this is the honest conversation about what the data is actually saying. Let me give you the mechanism behind the trend first, because the mechanism is more specific and more useful than the cultural narrative around it. Women are not opting out of men because they have stopped wanting connection. The research on what women who are choosing solitude or female-centered social lives are actually reporting does not support the narrative that they have transcended the need for intimate partnership, or that their decision is primarily ideological. What the research consistently shows is something more specific and more practically relevant. Women are opting out of the specific experience of intimate partnership with men as they have typically experienced it. The specific and documented pattern of emotional labor asymmetry, of bid system failure, of the invisible accumulation of unmet needs that I have described in detail in earlier videos in this series. They are not rejecting men. They are rejecting a specific and recurring experience of being with men that has a consistent and well-documented set of characteristics that produce a specific and consistent outcome. The experience of a woman who is doing the majority of the relational maintenance work inside a partnership with a man who is providing in the material sense, while remaining largely unavailable in the emotional sense, and who is discovering that the cost of that imbalance exceeds the value of the partnership. This is the gap. The specific and documentable gap between what most men have been bringing to long-term relationships and what the women in those relationships have been requiring from them. I have addressed the dimensions of this gap across multiple videos in this series: the emotional availability deficit, the bid system failure, the resentment archive, the invisible accumulation, Today I want to address it from the angle of the heterofatalism trend, because that angle reveals something about the gap's consequences at the cultural level that the individual marriage analysis does not fully capture. The consequences are these. When enough women in a demographic cohort have had enough similar experiences of the gap, when the individual experience of emotional labor asymmetry in a specific marriage becomes a shared and documented pattern that women are comparing notes on, building support communities around, and increasingly using as the basis for a collective assessment of whether partnership with men is worth pursuing. The individual experience becomes a cultural signal, and the cultural signal that is now running in the relational landscape that men over 50 are navigating is specific and significant. It says that the default male offering in intimate partnership, material provision, functional reliability, the specific form of presence that the provisioning model produces, is no longer sufficient to make partnership with a man a rational choice for a woman who has the economic independence to choose otherwise. That signal is not irrational. It is the aggregate response of a very large number of women to a very consistent experience. And the man who dismisses it as ideological or as unfair without engaging with what it is actually responding to is the man who will continue to be on the wrong side of it in every relationship he attempts going forward. Picture this. There is a man I know, I will call him Douglas, who came out of a 23-year marriage at 58, genuinely confused about what had happened. He had provided. He had been faithful. He had been present in every way his model of marriage had defined presence. He told me he had expected, when he re-entered the social world, to find that a man of his stability and his accomplishment and his demonstrated capacity for commitment would be received well by women in his demographic. What he found instead was something that confused and then deeply discouraged him. Women who were initially interested became progressively less so as the early connections developed. Women who had been warm and engaged in the first few meetings became distant and non-committal in ways that Douglas could not account for through any single behavior he could identify. He told me he felt as though he was failing a test he had not been told he was taking. He was. The test was not the one he thought he was taking. He was presenting his provisioning credentials, his stability, his reliability, his accomplishment, in a relational landscape that had moved past provisioning credentials as the primary currency of male desirability in intimate partnership. The women he was meeting were not unimpressed by his stability. They were specifically looking for something he was not yet offering. The specific and felt quality of genuine emotional presence, of genuine curiosity about their interior lives, of the capacity for the kind of intimate connection that the emotional economy of a long-term relationship requires. And in the absence of that quality, his provisioning credentials, however genuine and however significant, were insufficient to produce the sustained interest he was looking for. Douglas is not unusual. He is the representative man of this specific and significant gap between what the relational landscape now requires and what most men over 50 have been equipped to offer, and the gap is not fixed. It is not a permanent feature of his specific character. It is a skills deficit that is learnable, and that the man who addresses it genuinely, not as a strategy for attracting women, but as a genuine investment in his own capacity for the emotional dimension of intimate connection, is the man who finds himself on a different side of the heterofatalism trend than the man who takes the trend personally and responds to it with grievance. I want to give you the specific and honest account of what the trend is actually measuring, because understanding this precisely is the difference between taking it as a verdict on your worth and understanding it as information about a specific and addressable gap. The heterofatalism trend is measuring the cumulative female experience of 3 specific and consistent failures in intimate partnership with men. These 3 failures are not individual failures of individual men. They are systemic failures, patterns so consistent across enough relationships that they have produced the aggregate assessment that is now being expressed in the trend data, and they are failures that are directly addressed by the framework I have been building across this entire series. The first failure is the emotional availability failure. I have addressed this across multiple videos, and I am naming it here because, in the context of the heterofatalism trend, it needs to be understood not just as a relational failing that affects individual marriages, but as the primary driver of the aggregate female assessment that partnership with men is not worth its cost. Women are not opting out of connection. They are opting out of the specific and recurring experience of being emotionally alone inside a partnership with a man who is physically present and functionally reliable and emotionally unavailable in the specific and costly way that the emotionally unavailable man always eventually produces. The trend is, at its core, the aggregate response to the emotional availability failure at scale. The second failure is the development failure. This is less commonly named in the cultural conversation around the trend, but it is present in the research in a consistent and significant way. Women who are choosing to opt out of partnership with men are not only responding to past negative experiences, they are responding to a specific and documented pattern of male stagnation in long-term relationships. The tendency of men in established partnerships to stop developing emotionally, intellectually, and personally once the practical structure of the relationship is stable. Women who tend to continue developing across the lifespan of a long relationship in ways that the research consistently documents eventually find themselves in partnerships with men whose growth has plateaued in ways that create a specific and growing incompatibility. The development failure is the gap between who she has become through the years of the marriage and who he has remained. And the heterofatalism trend is, in part, the aggregate response of women who have experienced that gap and have decided that a future partnership with a man is likely to produce the same developmental stagnation rather than the genuine mutuality of two people who are both continuing to grow. The third failure is the reciprocity failure. This is the emotional labor asymmetry that has been documented with consistency across every major study of long-term heterosexual partnership in the last 3 decades. The persistent and significant imbalance between the relational maintenance work that women do in long-term partnerships, the emotional tracking, the bid responsiveness, the repair initiation, the investment in the health of the connection, and the equivalent work that most men bring to those same partnerships. The reciprocity failure is not the result of men not caring. It is the result of men not having been taught the specific skills that relational reciprocity requires, and operating, therefore, in a significant and ongoing deficit that the women in their partnerships are absorbing, and that the heterofatalism trend is the aggregate response to. These 3 failures are the mechanism behind the trend, and they are, this is the most important thing in this video, addressable. They are not fixed features of male psychology or male character. They are skills deficits. They are the product of a specific and well-documented failure of preparation that I have addressed across this series. The missing father-to-son conversation, the incomplete relational inheritance, the provisioning model that told men what the minimum requirement of partnership was, without telling them about the emotional economy that ran alongside it. And that was always the most important thing to the person they were building the partnership with. The man who addresses these 3 failures, not as a performance for a relational marketplace, not as a strategy for reversing the heterofatalism trend in his own life, but as a genuine investment in his own development as a person capable of the full range of intimate connection, is the man who is not on the wrong side of this trend. Not because the trend will reward him with the relationship he wants, but because the development the trend is demanding is the development that produces a genuinely better man, a man who is more fully himself, more genuinely present, more capable of the specific and real and deeply human experience of knowing another person and being known by them in return. That development is available to you. It is not too late for it. The research on adult development is unambiguous that the emotional availability skills, the affect attunement, the genuine curiosity, the repair fluency, are learnable at any age by any man who brings genuine intention to the learning. The man who was not taught them before his first marriage can learn them before whatever comes next. The man who ran the provisioning model for 25 years can develop the emotional economy skills that the provisioning model never required of him. Not to reverse the trend, to become the man who deserved to be in a genuinely mutual partnership all along, and who finally has the understanding and the motivation to build that capacity genuinely rather than performing it strategically. Here is the reframe I want to leave you with. The heterofatalism trend is not a verdict on male worth. It is a very large and very clearly documented piece of feedback about a specific and consistent gap between what men have been offering and what genuine partnership actually requires. Feedback, when it is honest and when it is received honestly, is one of the most valuable things available to a person who wants to develop. The man who receives this feedback defensively, who takes the trend as an attack and responds with grievance, is the man who remains on the wrong side of the gap. The man who receives it honestly, who asks what it is actually responding to, who identifies the specific and addressable failures it is documenting, who uses it as the motivation for the genuine development work that this stage of his life is uniquely positioned to support, is the man who is doing the most genuinely useful thing available to him with the information the trend is providing. Women are quitting men. Specifically, they are quitting the version of men that the provisioning model and the emotional availability deficit and the development stagnation and the reciprocity failure have been consistently producing. They are not quitting the version of a man who has done the genuine work of understanding what partnership actually requires, and who is bringing that understanding to bear on his own development with the same commitment and the same seriousness that he brought to every other significant undertaking of his life. That version of a man is not common. That is why the trend exists. but it is achievable. It is what this series has been building toward, and it starts with the honest reception of the most significant piece of relational feedback that the culture has produced in a generation. Drop a comment, men. When you look honestly at the three failures I described today, the emotional availability failure, the development failure, the reciprocity failure, which one do you most recognize in your own marriage? And what do you think it actually cost you? Subscribe to Relational Insights. Every week, Mr. Wesley breaks down the real dynamics of men and women in long-term relationships, with the honesty and the precision that finally gives men the complete picture of what the relational landscape is actually asking of them, and what they are genuinely capable of becoming.